the association actually imprisoned our clients. They did not let them leave the house, and they were forced to stay there because allegedly they had COVID and they shut down all their fobs, and it was a false imprisonment claim.
Welcome back, everybody. Today's guest is Luke S. Carlson, who is an attorney and founder of LS Carlson Law, who advocates for homeowners against abusive HOAs, and is the author of the new book, which just came out about a month ago, called Bad HOA, The Homeowner's Guide to Going to War and Reclaiming Your Power. So thank you so much, Luke, for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited. Thanks for having me on the show.
So, Luke, I was reading a 2024 survey that found that 6 out of 10 homeowners living in an HOA are dissatisfied with their HOA, aka their homeowners association. Why is this? Why is 60% dissatisfied with their HOA, their HOA?
Yeah, I would assume the number would be a little bit higher, but I'm biased, right? So everyone who calls me is dissatisfied. I think there's a lot of area for abuse, right? You have these volunteer boards, and I got to say this out front: if you get the right people on a board, they make a lot of sense. HOAs, when they're functioning, when you have a board that's following the CC&Rs, the governing documents, they provide a lot of value. But when they don't, when you have the wrong personality type, it just lends itself to a really bad situation very quickly.
When you're saying you think that number is higher than 60%, I mean, you have the CAI, which is the Community Associations Institute, which is kind of like a trade organization, so to speak, for the actual HOAs, and they report a much lower number. Obviously, they're biased, so the 60% I got was from Rocket Mortgage. What do you think then in your experience? I mean, what do you think the actual number is, if you think it's higher than 60%?
Yeah, I mean, it might be as high as the 70s. And you got to remember too, I think the frustration operates on the spectrum, and there could be very small issues that really aren't going to be reported. It's just a frustration point or a friction point for a homeowner. And it could be relatively small to these very massive disputes that absolutely impact quality of life and also fair market value in property, right? Some of the abuses or the negligence or the malfeasance results in real property damage. So, when I say a higher number over 60, I think I'm accounting for some of the smaller issues that probably don't hit anyone's radar. But we hear about it because we're sort of, we're on the front line of this. So I hear about the more ticky-tacky things that, on a very technical level are abuse or malfeasance, but I doubt that they're actually going to be reported.
In your book, Bad HOA, you basically say that there's several types of problematic board members. You have the tyrant, the meddler, the fool, and the self-dealer. Can you kind of explain the difference between these four? And then what would you say is the worst of these four?
Yeah. I actually read a comment. So, we have a podcast as well, and we were talking about this, and it said, someone said it sounds like a bunch of villains from a Batman movie. And I think that's somewhat accurate because, they are different sort of prototypes, right? And we've seen these historically. We've been at this for 17 years representing homeowners exclusively. And it's typically the usual cast of characters that are causing the problems. So, to answer, I guess, maybe two of your questions, the very worst is going to be the tyrant every time. The tyrant personality, I think, causes the most chaos and the most problems with the community. And typically, these are the individuals who got on the board not because of any altruistic driver, or they didn't say, hey, I think I can actually improve the neighborhood. They just wanted a place to sort of procure power and use it to their advantage. So the tyrant, that's the person who shuts people down at a meeting. If you're on a Zoom call, they're going to turn your mic off, and they really take their position as a form to rule and run a community, and often to their advantage and to the disadvantage of the community. So that's the tyrant type. The next one is the fool, or also we've called them the incompetent. And I think what's unique about that individual, and that's actually probably the best, if you're in a bad HOA and you have an incompetent or a fool, that might be the easiest situation to rectify, because it's not that this person is malicious or they're not power hungry. They simply don't understand that they have certain obligations under law. They don't understand that, the CC&Rs matter, or they have a fiduciary, or there's state law that they have to comply with. So often when you're dealing with that type of board member, it might just be an educational issue or a lack of information. So that's the fool. Meddler type is interesting. We've seen this historically. It's not really a power grab. It's someone who just loves the drama of it all. They got into the board because they were drawn to the fact that that's where a lot of the drama happens in the community, or a lot of the information is. So this is the individual, if you can imagine, that, has the clipboard and is in your backyard measuring your trees. They're just meddling, they're in their business, and there's often an overreach, or they're stepping beyond their boundaries as board members. They're going beyond what the law provides. So that's the meddler. And then the last category, this one's very problematic, I think, because they're very hard to spot. And that's the self-dealer, or also an embezzler type. Now, these are the people that we've seen are very much off the radar. There is no overt, sort of power struggle. They're not meddling. They're kind of keeping under the radar, because what they're doing is they're financially benefiting from their role. They might be siphoning off money. They might be the ones overseeing the books. But what they've done, and this is just a hypothetical, is, their cousin Larry is the landscaper. They've cut a deal with the cousin at well above fair market value. They're paying the landscaper, but they're getting a kickback for that contract. And it's off the radar to an extent, until it's not, until there's some sort of enforcement there. But the self-dealer, I think, is one of the hardest ones to identify.
In the case of the self-dealer, you just mentioned the example of this cousin Larry. So we'll just say, you got, Bob, who's the president of the board. His cousin Larry owns a landscaping company and we'll just say a trash collection company. So he hires his cousin to do this overcharge. Is this though even illegal? Because it's in the bylaws and whatnot, it seems like that the board member is well within his right to do that. Is this? I mean, I guess, is this legal or not legal? First of all,
well, I think it's state dependent, right? So I'm a California lawyer, so sort of my articulation of law always is California centric. Now in the book, it's more generalized themes. It's not linked to any sort of jurisdiction. So one always has to check with their specific jurisdiction, because laws change by way of state. But in a very general sense, if you're looking at contracts and associations entering into a vendor agreement, typically there's protocol around that. There's certain things that are baked into the CC&Rs or the governing documents that say, hey, this is how you were supposed to approach it. Maybe you're supposed to get 3 bids. Maybe it has to go to vote. But with a malfunctioning HOA or association, there's a sort of a disregard of the protocols, and they just do it. And they sort of do it under the sort of behind the scenes in the back rooms. And they don't really come to light until homeowners really push back. And they say, hey, you can't do this. And that's where I think the, sort of the need for the book came from in the first place, is sort of this notion of empowerment. Because a lot of homeowners that I've seen historically assume the association has all the power. They can just do it as the association. And I was really trying to drive a different narrative through the book.
Talking about the 4 types of problematic board members that we just went through: the tyrant, the meddler, the fool, and the self-dealer. So let's do the flip side then. What are the actual ones that are good for the HOA? I know you mentioned the hero in your book. Who are people that should actually run? Who do you want on the board?
Yeah, it's an interesting response that I'll give you. It's the people who really don't want to do it, but find that they have to, because the situation is so bad. And often the best boards that I've seen occur after a really bad HOA comes to an end, right? Their time is over. They get removed. Maybe they get recalled. But when that bad HOA or that bad situation goes away, a lot of the really good homeowners will rise up. And it's the homeowners that sort of see it as a way to preserve fair market value of the properties. They understand that, hey, there are rules, there's limitations in what we should do. and they understand the sources of those obligations. And typically it's in the governing documents or it's through state law. And it's the ones where they don't understand something, they seek professional counsel. And that could be through an association counsel or, management companies. Now, a lot of people absolutely hate management companies, and I get why. There are some really, really bad management companies out there, but there are some good ones that actually help boards navigate, running a community.
You were saying earlier that 70% of HOAs, people have a bad experience. Why is it that people live in an HOA then? If you're talking almost 3 out of 4 people are having a bad experience. It seems like if that's the case, why do we have HOAs then if the vast majority of people are dissatisfied with their HOA?
I like how you call it HOA. I find that funny. So I think one of the biggest, there's a huge upside. Let's start there. If you're in a community, an HOA that actually is functioning the way it's supposed to be, you're protecting arguably your biggest asset. You put a lot of money into your home. Majority of people, that is their primary asset. So an association in theory will protect it by way of certain regulations, standards, protocols. And so I think, intellectually speaking, it makes a lot of sense to buy in a community. The problem is when that community isn't functioning the way it's supposed to be. Now, I think the upside of it, though, is if you're in a bad association, there are ways to right the ship, to put it back on track. But, I think the curve here is the empowerment of the homeowner. Now, what's interesting, like I said, we've been at this for almost 17 years now. 10 years ago, the group of homeowners or the market really didn't understand that homeowners did have a tremendous amount of power. And so that's shifting though now a lot. I think that there's a new sort of understanding, or it's in the zeitgeist, that homeowners do have power if they know how to enforce it. And so just because you're in a bad association doesn't mean you have to stay in a bad association. And you can right the ship. We see it all the time.
In researching this topic in this book, I was shocked to find out that the last few years, 82% or over 80% of all new single-family houses built in America, in the U.S., are part of an HOA. And apparently a lot of municipalities actually require developers in order to get the permits to actually have a HOA. And then so they're essentially, you're getting like taxed twice. I mean, your HOA fee is essentially a tax, and then yet you're still paying property tax. The municipalities love it because they're offloading a lot of the responsibilities, whether this be trash pickup, street maintenance, snow plowing, or I should say snow removal, even like speeding tickets and things like that. You can enforcing parking, code enforcement activities. These are all kind of offloaded onto the HOA. So I think for me, like if you're trying to, especially like in certain states, like where you're at in California, try buying a new house that's not in a HOA. I mean, good luck. I mean, you have to go to the farm country, to the rural areas to actually even have an opportunity to buy a house that doesn't have any regulations. And to me, it seems like, people are forced into these HOAs kind of against their will if they want to be a homeowner. So I think that's where like something like your book comes in, because like you might not even think you're ever going to have to worry about a HOA, but you will. But why are so many new developments actually requiring a HOA? And what's your experience with this?
Well, you hit the nail on the head. You said it. It's a deferred cost for municipality, right? I mean, it makes economic sense. It's better for that region, so they encourage it, rightfully or wrongfully, right? I think you're actually going to see more and more. I don't think that they're going away. So instead of sort of fighting the current, let's get educated. Let's understand what it means. Because I think too, there's sort of a fog of war that existed around these where, okay, I'm in a HOA, to adopt your usage of that word. What do I do? I have this stack of documents that are, they're dusty. I hate, the board member. They're crazy. I don't know what to do. My life is horrible. But we're shifting that now. It's like, okay, yeah, you got this dusty stack of documents. Let's start looking at those. And how do you look at them? How do you read them? How do you engage them? How do you understand them? And then once you understand that, how do you start enforcing? How do you start leveraging that in your favor? Because it's not just a stack of dusty documents that mean nothing. They actually mean something. They're powerful. There's also state law. Let's understand what that state law looks like. Look at that. And these all of a sudden become very strong enforcement mechanisms where if you're in a HOA, you start realizing, hey, I'm not powerless here. Actually, I'm the one who has a lot of control. And it's the association, this group of volunteers that are, in the wrong. They're the ones who are engaged in malfeasance.
So as a HOA attorney, what are the most common kind of like situations that you get? And then secondly, or for, I mean, you can in any order, but like, when do people actually come to you? Because even in your book, it's like, you don't just call an attorney up on the first complaint or whatever. I mean, I guess maybe if it's like, major embezzlement or something like that. But generally speaking, I mean, maybe I don't know, you get some fine for not having your trash can in the wrong space, spot or something like that. I mean, you're not exactly going to hire you, but like, what are the main things that people contact you for? And then when does it escalate to the point where you actually need to hire an attorney?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I'm ironically an attorney who tries to discourage using a lawyer unless you have to. A lot of the people we consult with, I'll meet with them. And, my first approach is there a way to get this solved and rectified by not using us? And sometimes the situations are so bad where lawyer intervention is essential. You don't really have an option. It's something that is a necessary evil. But, looking at the spectrum of cases, on the one hand, you have sort of selective enforcement targeting, meaning, a homeowner is getting fined for activity that everyone else in the community is doing, but no one else is getting a fine. They're the only ones. So that's sort of a form of targeting. Or you have some sort of preferential treatment, meaning, there's a common area, green belt, and the green belt is beautiful in front of the association's house or the board member's house, and it's falling into a state of disrepair everywhere else. So, preferential treatment, that's a big issue. Another one we see in California a lot is, sort of water intrusion issues, and water intrusion that originates from a common area. So for example, common area drainage has been neglected over the years. And during a huge rainfall event, the drains don't work and the client's unit gets flooded. The home gets flooded and there's serious damage. Or they're in a condo, or maybe you call that a HOA, where, you have a common area roof, and the roof is supposed to be maintained by the association. The association hasn't done it for years, and all of a sudden a rain event happens and the unit gets flooded, because of the sort of the state of disrepair. So these are very common issues that you see, unfortunately. And had you have had a proactive association, going up to the roof, maintaining it, being responsible, these things wouldn't have happened. And they're mandated by way of the CC&Rs. They have to do it contractually, meaning the owner, even if they wanted to get up on the roof and repair it legally, they can't. They're not allowed to go up there. So, these are very common issues that we see daily.
I think in like the early 1960s, there was like 10 or something like HOAs in all of America. There was very few. And then in your book, you say that there's something like 77 to 80 million Americans that are living under a HOA, which is something around like 25% of the US population. Then I was looking, when I was researching it seemed like there was 22 states plus DC that has like a super lien, which means like if you default on your HOA fees, essentially the HOA can foreclose on you, and they have a super lien, which means they have priority over the mortgage company, aka the bank that actually gave you the loan, which seems absolutely insane that you could be behind like a couple $100 on your HOA fee, and then then you got like Bob the president buying your buying your apartment or your condo for like $6,000 or something. So like, I mean, as all these HOAs have exploded, it doesn't really seem like the way to handle them is actually kept pace to go from, a pretty, and then I was also looking like outside of Canada, there's not even many other countries that even have a HOA model. So what's the future looking like? I mean, are we going to see wholesale changes to this, or do you think that these quasi governments are fine the way they are, and we don't need wholesale changes.
Well, no, I think two things need to happen. Obviously my law firm, we represent homeowners and we're an advocate in that sense. But really how I saw the law firm and our experience and sort of the institutional knowledge was an empowerment platform. I wanted to empower homeowners. I mean, that's really why we did the book. That's why we have a podcast. It was to really say to the homeowners, stop, bowing down to bad HOAs. That time is over. Understand the power sources that you have. Figure out how to strategically approach these. Because I think too, if you can empower that base, the homeowner base, and they truly understand and they educate themselves about the laws that do protect them, that is going to start keeping these bad HOAs in check. But historically, you didn't really have that. I mean, I remember 10 years ago, we've represented some pretty large legal figures, judges included. And some of the judges we would consult with, they really didn't understand the mechanics of an HOA at the time. They're like, I got a really bad HOA. I'm really frustrated. They keep doing this, this, and this. I really don't know how to fight back on this. And the reason it is because largely this is a very niche and obscure area, or it was historically. 10 years ago, it was very hard to find an attorney who represented homeowners against associations. Now, most attorneys in the space were association attorneys. So the deck was already stacked to the association's favor. And we really became a trailblazer in this space once we applied a tremendous amount of intellectual rigor, trying to figure out, okay, how do the contractual rights work with the state statute, with the fiduciary, and how do these all interplay and how has case law interpreted it? And from that, we were able to devise very specific strategies for the homeowner. And so once I think the base, the homeowners start to understand, okay, there is more power, we can keep these HOAs in check, that's going to be a huge improvement to the space.
So in California, where you live with your law firm, LS Carlson Law, do you just do 100% HOA cases? That's all you do?
So we're in California and Florida. So I have a Florida team. Florida is primarily, HOA and condo association, owner facing. California is business and real estate. And the origin of the firm was actually a business and real estate litigation firm. And what happened was a lot of the business owners that we were representing in somewhat complicated business litigation matters would come to us and say, oh, I'm living in an association and I'm having a nightmare situation with this bad HOA. And so we sort of organically fell into the space. We didn't start the firm as an HOA firm. Again, it was business and real estate. But a lot of our clients lived in HOAs. They were having a lot of problems and they couldn't find a single attorney who understood this area of the law. So that's how we started to develop and look at this space and realize, oh my God, owners have a tremendous amount of power. And then we started to leverage it and we started to enforce and we started to take action and we started to represent these clients against the associations, which shocked the association attorneys at the time. They had no idea, what to do because typically they would steamroll everyone who would show up at the door, right? The association attorneys, they would just steamroll the owner. But we got very good and we gained a tremendous reputation in the space. So when it comes to representation, we're 100% homeowner. We never represent an association. We never go to the dark side of this. But we do have a business practice and we do have non-HOA real estate cases as well. But we have a very large HOA practice group.
Have you ever read the book HOA Warrior by Shelley Marshall by chance?
No, I've heard of it though. I've heard of it.
You've heard it? So actually, I read the book and I had a phone conversation with Shelley for like over an hour, talking about kind of her experience with this. But I mean, she basically says that the CAI, the Community Associations Institute, is a trade organization. It all benefits essentially the homeowners association, and that there's a lot of attorneys that won't even represent a lot of the actual homeowners. But then the whole thing also is weird because if you're a homeowner, you're essentially paying dues that then are going into this pool to then be used against you if you actually sue the HOA, right? It's like like it's just a very weird system. And like you mentioned earlier, where you said the best HOAs were actually those that kind of like had like a coup against them, where you had like these bad HOAs and then the good ones come in, and like there's always like like a famous quote, which is like you're always one vote away from having a hell HOA. Or so like basically I guess the question is, how do you actually set yourself up so you never have to even like deal with this? She talks about how you should be sending like birthday cards and every holiday send a card to all the board members, try to attend as many meetings as you can, try to get on good terms with these people, because they can essentially, like you mentioned, like your biggest investment is your house or condo. You don't really want to put that into jeopardy, but then it seems like if you're having to like go out of your way to befriend these people, it's like almost getting a full-time job. Maybe get a full-time job and then buying a place that doesn't have a HOA. I don't know. It's just
yeah, I've never contemplated it from a perspective of greasing wheels, and doing it that way. I don't disagree with involvement though. I think actual involvement in your association is a positive thing, and attending board meetings, understanding, invest some time into the association. I think that's part one. Part two, when a community is voting for members, know who the candidates are. Don't roll your eyes when that ballot comes in and say, oh my God, this is so annoying. Actually embrace that as an opportunity to maybe get a really good board in, because it behooves you. And I don't think the time investment to be an active community member is anything terribly significant. If you invested a handful of hours a quarter, or even 1 or 2 hours a quarter, I mean, that's a step in the right direction. And just being a little bit more proactive, sort of understanding who's running, voting for the right people, that right there is going to be preventative. You might be able to very well sidestep a bad board or a bad situation. And then two, let's say people do get on the board that, are creating a lot of chaos and havoc and causing problems. Be proactive. One of the biggest problems I see is people are so inactive for so long, and they let this problem kind of evolve. It snowballs. And I believe when bad actors get away with something, they're going to keep pushing those limits. They're going to keep pushing the boundaries, the overreach, the overstep. And you get into a situation where it gets so bad that when people do call us, and you did ask this, it's already, maybe a year or two deep. So much history has happened. There's so much chaos that's happened. And it probably would have been better had they have, sort of reached out earlier on, not waited a year, 6 months, 12 months to where it's a real problem, right? Sometimes you can avoid these earlier on. And so I think being an advocate for yourself, being mindful, and being sort of informed about the community is going to better the situation. I think that's how you avoid it. Maybe send some holiday cards too. I don't know.
Kind of mentioning how like a lot of these single family houses nowadays are also part of a HOA. Who are the clients that you mostly deal with though? Are they from like a condominium or a condo, whatever? I mean, the word is right. Condo, is that what we're calling it? And then you have the single family house HOAs. So who do you actually see more of? Like in the condo is a completely different experience than the single family house, right?
I think it's a pretty fair split, to be honest. I mean, it's interesting. If you look at our client base, I think it's one of the most interesting client bases, because on the one hand, you have, an individual, they own a $250,000 condo, and they're having this massive problem with their bad association. And then on the higher end of the spectrum, you have a $50 million home in an association, and they're also dealing with this nightmare situation. And what I find interesting is the emotion and the frustration is the same, right? You have a hardened business person who's worked their whole life to get into this really beautiful community, and their life is just in turmoil because this is where they live. This is, their pride and joy. That frustration is 100% equal to the person in the $150,000 condo, right? So it's an interesting psychology there. And when it comes to the actual properties and the structures, I think it's a pretty even spread. From a freestanding home to a condo to a townhome, they're all getting hit in similar ways. Maybe the issues are a little bit more unique, but it's pretty equal in terms of who do we see the most?
Right. And how do the issues differ? Like, what's an issue that the person in a condo would have that you would, that comes to you versus the single family house?
Yeah. So condos, you see a lot of common area disputes that involve either the roof or common area piping. Because, with a condo, you have your unit here, there's a unit here, but in between, that's often common area. And the pipes that are running between there are supposed to be maintained by the association. And so when there's a problem, it typically derives from a common area pipe, which would be different than a freestanding home. So a freestanding home, often it's the responsibility of the owner to maintain their roof. It's not an association issue. So the freestanding homes typically derive from common area green belts, for example, where there might be a drainage issue, and that's now impacting the home. Now, right, if it floods, there could be property damage as a result of that flooding. What's unique, though, I guess, amongst all are sort of the non-property damage issues. That's sort of the targeting, the selective enforcement, the preferential treatment. That's sort of agnostic to the type of structure, right? You see harassment, discrimination, targeting in condos. You also see it in the in the freestanding homes. So that's pretty consistent amongst the different housing types.
When do you get to the point where the best solution is just to sell? Do you ever recommend that to clients where it's like, maybe they're not even really, maybe they're just going to the letter of the rule book or whatever, but it just comes to the point where it's like, say, unselective or, not fair assessments or what, finding or whatever. So, your board member just doesn't like you. Are you actually even able to, like, in that? I mean, I imagine that's fairly common. I mean, that's like the meddler or whatever in your example. So you just got someone that doesn't like you because you're not giving her the gossip that this Karen wants to hear. So, I mean, if in this situation, do you just sell the condo? Because technically she's just like hitting you with the letter of the law, right? Are you able to prove that she's unfairly targeting you? Is that advice you give, or what would you say?
So it's interesting. When it comes to the sale of the property, one of the biggest considerations that you have to have is it also a disclosure issue? Meaning, if I sell my home, do I have to disclose a dysfunctional association? Do I have to disclose that they're not complying with, at least in California, the Davis-Sterling Act, that there's no votes, that they're underfunded? Do I need to disclose that there's an ongoing water intrusion issue? That there's a leaky pipe, there's a common area that continuously floods? And so often the response to that is yes, there is a disclosure requirement. Now, it's always fact dependent, but if there is a disclosure issue, now you're talking about a depreciation of fair market value. So if I have to disclose, yes, this pipe always leaks, the property's worth $750,000, but now I'm going to lose 10%, 20%, because no buyer is going to want to pay the full fair market value. So now we're fighting over more than just a leaky pipe, because if I go to sell, I'm losing fair market value. So that's a factor that has to go into that equation. And sometimes it's better just to fight back, be aggressive, knock the Karen to the side, sort of put the association back on track. And then, great, if you love the property and if life is good afterwards, continue to be there. But maybe after you've gone through the war, you then decide to sell the property, at least you get full fair market value. Because that's a hard bullet to swallow, losing 10, 15%, 20% in California on a property.
When I was doing the research, like you're basically saying, we have 50 states, plus we have, DC, plus we have, Puerto Rico, which is where we're based. But anyways, so, you basically have like 52 different kind of legal frameworks to go from. But I was reading a 2022 study that said that over 70% of HOAs had inadequate reserve funds, which means that at some point they're basically going to have a special assessment. And then reading some of the books, I've read Privatopia by Professor Evan McKenzie, where he's like, let's say you buy a condo and like you need to replace the roof and you're on the board. Well, like, hey, the roof has, I don't know, 8 more years left. We can use those funds to beautify the whole HOA the rest of the property so it looks good, and then I'll just sell before we ever have to even replace the roof. So it seems like there's kind of like this misalignment where the people that are in charge of the funds know what, they kind of know the timeline when they can sell. And also like, what is like a lot of the infrastructure kind of has like a 30-year shelf life before a lot of things have to be replaced. And the average homeowner in the US only owns their house for like 7 to 10 years anyways. And then like, we're having all these HOAs, and it seems like all of a sudden now, like, a lot of this maintenance is coming due. You're seeing especially this like in Florida, where in the 90s, they, all of a sudden people are, a lot of the retirees are flooding there. Now, all of a sudden you're having all these issues, and their HOAs are like $1,000 a month. I mean, I was kind of looking out of curiosity since we're vacationing right now in North Carolina, but I was looking at Myrtle Beach, and a lot of HOAs were like between $1,500 and $2,500 a month. I'm like, on like a $200,000 condo. I'm like, your HOA is more than your mortgage. I mean,
Right. Mortgage. Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about that. So undercapitalization is often a byproduct of financial mismanagement. Okay. So when you see a lack of reserves, when you see, an HOA is like, well, we just don't have any money. That is not something that happened because there was good financial procedures and they were followed and we just ran out of money. That was because there was likely some sort of financial negligence or mismanagement. So then again, that kind of goes back to who are you going to put on the board? Who's overseeing the financials, making sure you have a good group of people who actually have the capability of, sort of running this community in a financially sound manner. The other thing you raised too, though, is at least in California, there's this notion of fiduciary. The association or the board needs to always be thinking about what is in the best interest of this community. And so, a scenario arguably where, a board member is like, well, we have to repair the roof, but let me just jam this budget into a beautification project so that I can bounce and sell very quickly. That would be very problematic from a fiduciary, right? I mean, that seems to be in direct conflict with that. If you are looking to be on the board to personally sort of, benefit to the detriment of the community as a whole, that's problematic, right? That's likely a breach of fiduciary, and you're going to probably have a whole host of other problems sort of approaching it that way.
But would you be able to prove that, though, I guess, right? You'd have to, lawyer up and prove that they were just not incompetent, but made conscious decision to. It just seems like even if, like, I guess I don't know how you'd even ever.
Well, you're right. It's always a burden of proof. At the end of the day, that's our judicial system is imperfect, but it is what it is. So everything becomes a burden of proof. I mean, even a situation where if I lend someone $1 million and they breach, I still have to prove up the fact that I lent them the money, I sent them the money, and they agreed to it, and so proof is always at the core of any dispute. And, there's ways to prove things up, though. I mean, you get experts in, you say, hey, what were the best practices? Did they fall below the standard of care in deciding to allocate all the money to flowers when we had a roof problem that was coming due in a year? What's the expert going to say?
Let's just take you through like being a potential home buyer in an area that has an HOA. So, I mean, it seems like a lot of states, they don't even actually have to have full transparency. I mean, certainly once you want to know, like if the HOA is going to have some, financial issues where they're going to have a special assessment, I guess, what would be just like step one? I mean, you want to make sure that you're buying into a HOA that's going to have plenty of reserves and whatnot. So like, what's step one? What are questions someone should ask to even consider purchasing either a home or a condo with a HOA?
Yeah. So, I think that there are some easy things that people can do before they buy in to see, you're really trying to identify red flags in the community. What happens, I think a lot of the time is people show up at a house and say, oh my God, this is my dream house. I want this house. And they're only really looking at the house. But what they also should be looking at is the community at large. Go check out the common areas. Look at the green belts. Look at if there's a tennis court, if there's a pool. What is the condition of those, sort of common area elements of the community? Now, if they're well maintained, that's probably a good sign. But if you're seeing, buildings or tennis courts that are in a state of disrepair, that in and of itself might be a red flag. So those are sort of the open and obvious ones, right? Secondarily, get a copy of the CC&Rs. Ask your real estate agent. The agent should be able to procure those. And if for whatever reason you can't get a copy, or the HOA or no one wants to disclose, that might be a red flag. The other good tip, and this is an interesting one, but it's a very easy one. At least in California, it's very easy. I can't really speak to other states. But if you're in Orange County, for example, and you're thinking about buying in an association, if you go to the court website, Superior Court website, you can do a case search and you can search by name. And if you go to the court website, you search by name and you enter in the association that you're about to buy in, and you see 10 lawsuits come up, that might be a bit of a problem. And it's interesting because you're looking at it, well, is it the association suing owners, or is it the owner suing the association, or is it both? These are just general red flags. And honestly, at least in Orange County, it costs maybe a couple bucks to run this search. And it's tremendously beneficial information. Now, if you pull it up and you don't see any lawsuits, that's probably, that is a good sign, right? And, these are small things that you can do. It's not a huge time investment. Economically speaking, it's very low barrier, but it's not a bad idea if you're really serious about buying a house.
One of the things that I was kind of shocked about is that these HOAs are essentially like private or mini governments, and they can take away your rights, right? Like you could, you don't have freedom of speech. I've seen situations where it's like, oh, you want to fly an American flag in your yard, you have a single family house. Like, nope, no flags allowed. You can't do that. Like you want to, put like a sticky note on your neighbor's door to be like, hey, I left a cake for you or something like that. Nope, that's not allowed. You want to post something on social media where you mention one of the board members. Oh, that's not allowed. You can get fined. I don't know. It just seems like it takes a special kind of person to join a HOA. They don't know what they're getting into. It seems like, like you're saying though, it has to be if it's a bad HOA,
Well, listen, you are going to give up certain rights when you enter into an HOA. You're agreeing to certain limitations, but those limitations can be identified before you buy into the community, right? If you show up and you actually get the CC&Rs and they're 10 pages, they're very straightforward. They have some rules, but these rules are practical. Let's say we do not want Christmas lights or any holiday lights up in June. You got to take them out, remove them within a certain amount of time. Okay, maybe that sounds reasonable. We don't want any cars on blocks in the front yard. Okay, that kind of makes sense. So you are going to be able to gauge how strict this community is before you buy. I think it's a situation where someone buys in and goes, oh my God, there's so many rules. This is so unfair. Well, you do have some initial ways to vet that beforehand. But you're 100% right. You are giving up certain rules, but you're also, in my mind, in the right situation and with a good HOA, you're also gaining a lot of protections. And again, those protections are protecting that fair market value of the property, of your biggest asset. So yes, you're giving things up, but you're also sort of gaining some things when it works. There's always an asterisk when I say this, but when it works.
So if someone was asking you like, hey, should I buy into a HOA? What would your advice be? It doesn't seem like it's going to be a binary answer. It's not like it's yes or no. Obviously, you're going to have to figure out what is going on with this.
Yeah, I'll give the most lawyer answer that people love. I'll say it depends. People hate that when lawyers say it, but it depends. If I was to look at 5 associations and if I was to run an analysis, I could tell you which one to buy into and which one not to buy into. Not because I can guarantee one's going to be bad and one's going to be good, but I can kind of look for things that I would, have concern, or there might be issues that I'm identifying, which make it less desirable, right? So I'm not anti-HOA necessarily. I'm definitely anti-bad HOA, but they can serve a benefit and they have a utility when they're actually functioning.
I was talking to one of my buddies he's been a real estate agent since 1983, and he lives in Boulder, Colorado. And so I like called him up, in like preparation for this podcast. I'm like, oh, you must have dealt with a lot of HOAs over the years, And he's like, actually, yeah, I just dealt with mine for 5 years. So I just sold my condo because I was sick of dealing with them. but I guess, the question is, if you have a good HOA, what are the benefits of the good HOA? Like, what's the best case scenario? Your property values are going to be higher. You're going to have a good community. It's going to be upkept. Are these the actual like upsides of an HOA? The downsides seem, and are the upsides worth more than the potential downside of getting your home foreclosed on because you got some speeding tickets because your carpet cleaner, or something like that in the communities? It just seems, what's the upside and downside?
Yeah. So obviously the downside is the things that we're discussing, right? I guess at the extreme, it's the full loss of the property, assuming, by the way, that's legal and they follow the proper protocols. And there's a lot of regulation behind foreclosure. I'm not a foreclosure attorney, right? That's outside of what we do. But when we are talking about upside, I would say predictability, meaning you can sort of predict and sort of gauge what the aesthetic of the community is going to look like. If that matters to you. Sometimes it doesn't matter, but some people want a harmonious community. They want the aesthetic to be consistent, meaning I don't want to worry that someone's going to put a zebra mailbox next to my house. Not that I have anything against zebra mailboxes, but some people might. They like that sort of consistency within, or the harmonious feel of a community. The other thing I think that could be beneficial is the protection you have from an enforcement perspective. So for example, in California, if you have a neighbor who is blaring music all the time, or is, constantly, cooking or grilling, and smoke is just bellowing into your property in a very consistent manner, and it's just all the time, and it's basically making your life a living hell. In an association, you would have certain enforcement mechanisms that you wouldn't have in a non-HOA. So for example, California, that activity of the neighbor might actually be a breach of contract claim. So you might instead of just going after them for nuisance, you might be able to allege breach of contract and sort of engage the legal system in a different way that you wouldn't have been able to if it was a non-HOA. And what I mean by that, in California, at least, we have the Davis-Sterling Act. So what that allows a homeowner to do is demand mediation before filing a lawsuit. So you have an opportunity to sort of force that neighbor, that, bad acting neighbor, into a mediation where you might be able to resolve it without having to go full-blown litigation. Mediation, of course, is less expensive, more economic, and more efficient than having to file suit. So, there's different legal protections that you have in an association, primarily really when it comes to the CC&Rs and the governing documents, that allow you not only protection, but also ways to enforce your rights against others if those rights are being infringed upon. So that might be a benefit. You can look at it that way.
What's the most outrageous story or situation without breaking, client attorney privilege, but what's like the kind of like a general, absolutely ridiculous story?
Yeah, so we have one out of Florida. I didn't handle this case, but it was in the news, so I can talk about it. This was during COVID, and our client or our allegations in the lawsuit was the association actually imprisoned our clients. They did not let them leave the house, and they were forced to stay there because allegedly they had COVID and they shut down all their fobs, and it was a false imprisonment claim. We went after them for false imprisonment, and then that was the first. We've never had a false imprisonment claim in the history of this law firm. So that was a very outrageous one, and it resolved very well, but that was pretty egregious.
So that's basically like the exception, though, not the norm. That was like do you have every day, are you like, man, I just can't believe this is going on, or is it more just like kind of like mundane? Are they just like things that blow your mind every day, or is that more rare?
No, well, yeah, I guess you do become a little bit jaded to things. And like when someone brings something up, you see a spectrum in your head of where it falls in terms of how egregious. right? So I still think things do hit the mark though, where I'm like, oh my God, that's insanity. And typically those types of cases are more geared towards sort of targeting harassment, where someone is being, just really harassed by a group of people. That seems to be outside of the norm, because it's one thing to be on the board and, okay, fine, you didn't maintain the green belt because of some incompetency, or you were just negligent, or you just didn't understand how, or, arguably, I mean, even financial mismanagement, that's bad in and of itself. But you can kind of say to yourself, okay, I get it. They were just really incompetent when it came to bookkeeping. They didn't understand how to do this. It's a totally different thing, though, where a board member or a group of board members say, you know what, we don't like this family. We don't like these homeowners. Let's actually make their life a living hell. And let's do things that are so outside of the norm to torture and just harass and just, make them miserable. That always hits the radar of shocking, I would say.
Is that rare, would you say, when like something like that?
No, I say we see it almost weekly. Out of California and Florida, I mean, we're pretty big. We're not a huge law firm, but we're a big enough operation where we see a lot of cases. So no, we would probably see that fact pattern on a weekly basis.
Today's guest has been Luke S. Carlson, an attorney and founder of LS Carlson Law, who advocates for homeowners against abusive HOAs. We discussed his book, Bad HOA, The Homeowner's Guide to Going to War and Reclaiming Your Power. So, Luke, just two kind of final questions. One, where can people get a hold of your book? And also, if they happen to live in Florida or California, can they get a hold of you if they have any issues with their own HOA? And then finally, leave us with a concluding thought to wrap up this podcast related to HOAs.
Okay. I actually have a copy. So this is the book, Bad HOA. Oh, can you see it?
Yeah, we can see it.
Available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. You can check it out there. I mean, if you don't want to buy the full copy, get the digital copy. It's dirt cheap and it's worth it. I think there's a lot of really strong strategic advice in there. The firm again is California, Florida, LS Carlson Law. So feel free to check out our website. Obviously I'm California, so I can only help in California, but we have a wonderful Florida team that's brilliant at what they do. And final words of advice, I think the strongest messaging is sometimes you have to declare war to secure peace. I think people need to understand that. Sometimes you have to push back, you have to fight back, or the situation isn't going to change. Either accept it or fight back. And sometimes the war is warranted if you actually do want to right the situation.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.